This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff begins today's show as he discusses different reasons cattle could be lame. He also reminds producers the importance of having a relationship with a veterinarian as livestock needs cared for. Today's show continues with weed management specialist from K-State, Sarah Lancaster, to review proper pesticide use and the value of the label on pesticides. We are also joined by Mary Marsh from Kansas Wheat with information about the upcoming Wheat RX. Finishing today's show is K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd discussing a number of insect pests to be aware of, including bagworms, boxwood leaf miner, aphids, and asparagus beetles. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and now we're going to talk about lameness, specifically in cattle as we enter the grazing season. And in to talk about that is K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. A.J., thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be in.
To get started, the first initial one that comes to my mind when thinking of lameness in cattle is foot rot.
Absolutely. So foot rot, many producers refer to all cattle lameness as foot rot. They've got that foot rot, doc. So I do want to break down today some of the common pasture lameness. Here we are, a lot of producers, hopefully if they have enough grass for turnout. We have cattle going into summer grazing opportunities. Along with kind of this summer issue, we oftentimes run into some of these lameness concerns. So foot rot is only one of those. Foot rot is a very specific condition. It's a bacterial infection just under the skin in the lower foot. So what happens with foot rot? It's caused by a bacteria. Now that bacteria is commonly found in the environment, in cow manure, in the intestinal tract of cattle. It's Fusobacterium. Now that bacteria does not invade the skin. In order for foot rot to actually take a hold is we need to have a breakdown in that protective barrier of the cow skin. So that protective barrier, usually we have breakdown in between the two toes. Now that can be caused by a lot of different situations. Throughout Kansas and throughout the plains, we're in a pretty severe drought. Right? Dry conditions, we can see cracking of we call it the interdigital space in between the toes. We can have drying, we can have cracking. All of a sudden we crack that skin enough. Similar that if you have really dry lips in the winter, that's what can happen to their hooves or in between their hooves. And then that crack allows this bacteria to get under the skin and really flourish. So they call it foul foot because it smells so bad. Those cattle producers may be giggling to themselves right now, but those that are accustomed to the smell of foot rot, that bacteria gets in there. It really thrives in a low oxygen environment, and it has a very distinct smell that some cattle producers can actually smell downwind. So we use all of our senses to help diagnose, but one of them can be our nose. Now, the foot rot, we do have lameness. It is a cause of lameness, usually just one foot, can be any of the 4 feet. Now, it is accompanied with symmetric swelling. Okay, and what I mean by that is there's swelling on both sides, equal on both sides of the foot. So up both toes, usually that swelling generally starts, it's the path of least resistance that we get swelling. So it usually starts on the backside of the hoof, just below the dew claws. As it builds and as those bacteria release these toxins that create even more inflammation, it splits the toes. We'll see the toes split apart, and we'll see swelling actually increase up the leg, even up to the fetlock. And it's swollen, it smells, it's painful. That is foot rot. Now, thankfully, true foot rot, we can treat them, and they do remarkably well. With our injectable systemic antibiotics, there's a number of different products that can be utilized for cattle producers to treat this disease. So, again, work with your local veterinarian, have a treatment plan in place, be prepared. Okay, it's not the easiest to go out into a pasture to be able to gather. We don't need to gather the entire group, but have a plan in place to be able to, whatever your treatment method is, to be able to get these products into those animals. And if it's true foot rot, we catch them early, we give them the appropriate therapy. They get better within just a couple days. Within about 3 days, they are off to the races, literally. No more lameness. It's healed up remarkably. That's a treatment success. However, if it doesn't get any better, we may have something a little bit more sinister going on.
Talking about real fast about the breakdown of that protective barrier on their foot. Are there times that there's something in the pasture and the cattle have stepped on it and people might think it's foot rot at first look?
So there are circumstances that we can get confused. It looks like foot rot from a distance, but without getting up and close and personal and making sure that it truly is foot rot, that we have the breakdown in the skin, we have the swelling, there are things that can look like it. And that's actually foreign body material, right? Sometimes we have a thorn that got stuck in the foot. But more commonly, we get things wrapped around the feet. It's amazing how this happens, but stray pieces of smooth wire out in the pasture, baling wire, right? That, was along a fence line somewhere. They get it wrapped up around their feet. I've even seen baling twine. You wouldn't think that twine would get wrapped up. I talked to producers all over the state. I've even heard about rings off of an oil filter from a tractor somehow got on a calf's foot. So if you do see some type of straight line, okay, where looks like something is entrapping the foot, we need to pick those feet up and make sure that we don't have a piece of wire, make sure we don't have a piece of baling twine or something that's actually wrapped up in that foot, because without removal of that, it's not going to heal.
A lot of people cough everything foot rot when it's something wrong with the hooves of cattle, but there's a lot more and a lot of different causes of cattle being lame. And one of those is single-sided or asymmetric swelling. So is that where the hooves aren't looking swollen the same on both sides?
That's correct. So I mentioned symmetric swelling for foot rot. So the swelling is equal on both sides of the foot going up. But some of those non-responsive, quote-unquote, foot rots, and I mentioned something more sinister might be going on, those are deep infections. So it's really important to see that if you have a lame animal, if there's only one toe, so to speak, that has swelling, there's something different than that. That's not a regular foot rot. When we look at what's the structure of the foot, we have skin, we have bone, we have tendon, we have joint, right? There's not a whole lot of tissue down in the lower parts of the foot. So we have to be very cautious. If we have one-sided swelling or a non-responsive foot rot, usually we have some of those deeper-seated infections in some of those critical layers. Foot rot is just under the skin. Now, those deep, sinister infections are either in bone, joint, or tendon sheath, and further therapy and longer-term therapy is definitely necessary to make sure we can get those animals healed up.
You talked about joint swelling, but that's cattle being lame more than just their joint of their hoof, but also possibly up in their elbows.
There are. So especially some of our younger calves, if we had some respiratory disease possibly go through them pre-weaning when, we're fresh off the cow. So some of our fall-born, kind of our fall calves that we might be weaning and might be turning them out to grass, or even some of our calves that are on the cow right now. These young animals, usually it's after a bout of respiratory disease, we get what's called septic arthritis. And that's an arthritis that is caused by a bacteria, either Mycoplasma or Staphylococcus, that those bacteria get seeded in to some of the big joints. So the big joints being the stifle or the carpus. So the big joints on the front legs, the elbow, the back leg, we can see it in the hip, oftentimes the stifle or even a little bit lower. But when we see these big joints that swell up, we have to make sure that, okay, yes, it's carrying a leg and it's lame, but the foot is normal. Where is the swelling? And if it's in some of those bigger joints, we know right away that it's septic arthritis, and working with your veterinarian for a treatment regimen will be necessary because it takes a little while to heal up. We can get rid of the bacteria, but it's a long-term care to get those animals over it.
You've mentioned taking a look and seeing where the swelling is, what it looks like, and maybe what it smells like. But what if you just see a cow that's lame, but everything looks perfectly fine with them?
Sometimes we can have issues actually inside the hoof itself. For some of our yearlings that are turned out to Flint Hills grass or, getting turned out and grazing yearlings, some of those fresh arrivals right off the truck, during their handling process prior to showing up to your operation possibly, they could have damaged their soles. Okay, so we can actually get what's referred to as toe tip necrosis or toe abscesses. These toe abscesses are tough to manage, and they show up with just odd shifting lameness. The animals are painful. They're kind of angry. They're flighty, and it's just they stand awkward. Right? They stand trying to protect their damaged toes. Try to imagine if you slammed your thumb in the car door and your thumb is just sitting there throbbing, right, underneath the nail of your finger. Now, that's painful enough. You feel your heartbeat in it. Now imagine trying to walk on it. And that's essentially what happens with these toe abscesses is they have a breakdown in the hoof wall and the sole where they come together called the white line, and it allows for bacteria to get in there and forms a small abscess. And that pressure is immense. So if we do have these odd shifting lameness, definitely get a better look at the feet the hooves themselves, making sure we don't have for cows, whether we don't have a sole bruise or sole abscess. For some of our yearlings, usually it's at the tip of the toe, and we refer to that as toe abscesses. Those definitely, we need to get those in, pick up their feet. We can use hoof testers just like they do on horses. We can figure out which toe they are. Usually it's the back feet, the outside toe. That's the most common place that we run into toe abscess issues, and it's flighty cattle, fresh off arrival, probably been on a truck for a little while or maybe been run across some rough concrete. But whatever it was to damage their foot, now we're stuck with them. We need to get appropriate therapy into them.
Caring for your livestock is very important, so a good way to do that is be in contact with your local veterinarian and have a game plan put up kind of before you start down this path.
It is. Working with your veterinarian to have a predetermined course of action is what I like to say. Working with your vet to be able to have products on hand, whether they're prescription, which we do have some changes with antibiotic availability coming up. A lot of our over-the-counter medications that you didn't need a prescription, those are transitioning into prescription. You may see that things like LA200 or oxytetracycline, penicillins, those products, they all have labeled for foot rot. Right? However, due to the changes coming up here in June 11th, new products that are hitting the market that'll start coming onto the shelves will have a prescription label. So you'll only be able to purchase those either through your local veterinarian or through a registered pharmacy. So you can do that as long as you have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. We refer to that as a VCPR. And for everybody out there, that's just having a good working relationship with your local veterinarian.
AJ, thank you so much for coming in and talking about lameness in cattle as we enter the grazing season.
Thank you.
If you would like to read his article, it is titled Prepare Today to Combat Lameness This Grazing Season, and it will be linked in today's show notes, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome to Agriculture Today. Now we're going to talk about proper pesticide use, and in to do it is K-State Weed Management Specialist, Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thank you for coming in and joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
When you use pesticides, before using them properly, you should protect yourself. What does that look like?
It can be very tempting, especially as it gets warmer into the application season, to skip PPEs because they can be burdensome. But they're important because we don't know a lot about what long-term, low-level exposure does to people. Folks kind of frown on testing those kinds of things in a laboratory. So using pesticides safely to prevent that kind of chronic exposure is important. And so usually it's as simple as rubber gloves or some sort of waterproof gloves, long sleeves, long pants, covered, shoes or boots. And then sometimes eye protection, right? When you're mixing, you don't want things to splash back in your face. But it doesn't have to be fancy. In my research program, we do a lot of hand spraying, and so we wear a lot of Tyvek trying to prevent contamination of our clothes. But that's a specialized case. Usually it's just long sleeves, long pants, and keeping a change of clothes handy in case you do have a spill or an accident or a leak can be really important to keep folks safe.
So if people are dressed appropriately and they're all safe that way, how do they know if they're going to use their pesticide properly?
I'm going to make a bumper sticker for a lot of things that I say in my job. And one of them is the label is the law, right? That's kind of the mantra or the motto for a lot of weed scientists when we talk about pesticide application concerns. I know that labels are about as much fun to read as the first chapter of Matthew that lists the genealogy of Joseph. It's long, it's tedious, but it does have important information that gives us information about how to apply the pesticide so it's safe for us, it's safe for our crops, and it's safe for our neighbors. So the label is the law is the short answer there, Shelby.
Sarah, you've mentioned that the label is the law, and I'm assuming a portion of that also factors into environmental safety. So what are important things looking at pesticides for that?
So environmental safety with pesticides all starts with keeping the product in the field. As farmers and agricultural folks, we know that we want to spend money on products that are going to work for us, and it's not going to work for us if it ends up someplace other than our field. But for the other 98% of the population, they're concerned about what is that herbicide or insecticide or whatever going to do when it gets into the environment. In particular, we pay a lot of attention to aquatic environments because the animals and the plants that live there are kind of the bottom level of the food chain, right? And things kind of go up from there. So really, as we think about environmental protection, it's anything we can do to keep the herbicide in the field. So from things to mitigate drift to application practices that prevent runoff, anything like that. Now, one thing I will say here, Shelby, is that as we think about the current regulatory environment and the fact that the EPA has been court mandated to start enforcing the Endangered Species Act, we're going to see some very much more direct and specific language on the labels around preventing off-target movement. So just something for folks to be aware of as they think about pesticide use going forward.
And in pesticide use, you mentioned drift. So not only keeping it on the field, but keeping it on your intended field. That's
right. In recent years in weed management, we've had a lot of conversation about drift for a particular herbicide. But herbicide drift happens every year. Farmers and applicators have to balance weather conditions with weed and crop conditions. And sometimes, you might be on label, but you can still have things move. So just being a good neighbor and paying attention to wind direction, things of that nature, because you don't want to cause damage to sensitive crops that are in the neighborhood of where you're making your application.
And on that, also over-application. Just because something's there doesn't mean spray more.
Right. So it can be tempting to under-apply to save costs or to over-apply in terms of the rate to try to control larger weeds or weeds that are drought-stressed or what have you. Aside from the statement that the label is the law and it's an off-label application, part of that conversation about over-application goes back to things we've talked about. One of them is those herbicide residues, right, that could be in the next crop. We don't have data, right, to say that that rate is safe to keep those residues from happening. The other thing is herbicide residues in the soil, and here's where farmers start to perk their ears, right, is because if you over-apply, you're setting yourself up for potential carryover concerns, which would mean that even though you used a herbicide that is labeled for your crop rotation, you applied it at a rate that's too high, so that herbicide is still going to be around potentially when you plant the next crop.
We've talked about applying it. Now, what if we talk about the licensure and all the work that goes into being able to apply?
Yeah, so one of the components of the label that is the law is a statement a lot of times that you'll see on herbicides that say it's a restricted use pesticide. And that just means that the regulators have decided that this product has a certain level of risk for applicators or individuals in the vicinity or for the environment that requires some additional safety training. Atrazine is a great example of a restricted use pesticide that we use all the time in corn and grain sorghum production, but it is a restricted use pesticide, and so we have to pay extra attention to things like rates and the types of soils on which we use it and making sure we don't have runoff, things of that nature. And so legally, in order to apply a restricted use pesticide, an applicator needs to have an applicator's license. And there's two kinds of applicator license. There's a private applicator license and a commercial applicator's license. Either of those can allow you to purchase restricted use pesticides, but if you're going to apply them for someone else, obviously you're going to need that commercial pesticide applicator's license. The other thing to think about is that we're starting to see more herbicides that have herbicide-specific training. So, for example, dicamba, if you're going to use Extendamax or Ingenia, you need to have extra training in order to legally purchase those products, and paraquat or gramoxone types of products are another good example. Because of the risk for the applicator and the handlers, we need to have some additional safety training there just to make sure everybody knows what the recommended practices are.
If producers are thinking about starting to apply their own pesticides, what does that process look like for getting started in that for them?
So the process for getting an applicator's license is pretty straightforward. All of the information is on the Kansas Department of Agriculture website. They are the ones that issue the licenses. Your county or district extension agent can also help you with that. They can provide for the private applicator's license, can provide you a place to take the test. There are study materials available for each of the different types of commercial applicators' licenses and for the private applicator's license as well. I will also say that I know that the EPA has approved some changes to the licensure process. I have to confess that I am not fully up to speed on what those look like or when they're going to become active, but I do know that there's a lot of talk that it is going to become more difficult for folks to get private pesticide applicators licenses. And so if anybody's on the fence about that, now may be a good time to go ahead and make that decision to get that license for private pesticide application.
Sarah, we've talked about a few different things today. What are some of the key messages you want producers to know?
Take-home points, I think we've probably said it a dozen times. The label is the law. And I know it's not fun reading. I know it's not easy reading because every label is structured differently, and it's usually in print that requires a magnifying glass. But the label is the law, and if you have questions about how to use a particular product, that's really your first and one of your best sources of information to answer questions about herbicides or other types of pesticides is the label. And I think the other thing to think about is just making sure that we are using our tools properly so that we can have these tools in the future. I talked about kind of the 2% versus the 98% earlier, and I think it's important that we be able to tell the 98% that we are using these tools as safely as we can, so that we have a good argument for when folks tell us that we shouldn't be able to use some of these products.
That was K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster. If you'd like to read more on these topics, you can do so by using the links in our show notes, which can be found on agtoday.net. We are now joined by Mary Marsh from Kansas Wheat as she discusses the upcoming WheatRx.
The WheatRx schools are a part of a partnership between the Kansas Wheat Commission and K-State Research and Extension to disseminate the latest research recommendations for high-yielding and high-quality wheat to Kansas wheat farmers. Girong Zhang, a K-State wheat breeder based in Hayes, will walk attendees through the breeding plots and discuss up-and-coming genetics for wheat varieties in western Kansas. He'll also talk about wheat streak mosaic disease research and improvement of wheat quality. Augustin Obor, K-State Associate Professor of Soil Science, will discuss what researchers have learned after 48 years of tillage and nitrogen fertility management research. He'll also discuss the challenges of long-term no-tillage systems despite improvements in soil properties. Romulo Lulato, K-State Wheat and Forage Extension Specialist, will discuss the intensification of wheat production for combined food security and environmental stewardship, the role of wheat agronomy for simultaneously improving yield and quality and producing more wheat with a lower environmental footprint. Kelsey Anderson-Onofree, K-State Assistant Professor of Plant Pathology, will provide an update on wheat disease and management. Finally, Lucas Haig, K-State Northwest Area Crops and Soil Scientist, will present the economics of wheat production. The May 25th WheatRx School will be held at the KSU Agricultural Research Center in Hayes from 8 a.m. to noon. Attendance at the event will be free, however, registration is required. Register for the WheatRx events at kswheat.com/WheatRx.
Once again, that was Mary Marsh with Kansas Wheat. We have more ahead for you on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd says there are a number of insect pests to be keeping an eye on, including the boxwood leaf miner, aphids, and even bagworms.
Although we might be considered early, next week will be the 15th, I would say look for the small bags on the plants. And if you see them, it's obviously probably warranted to make a treatment. But if not, just keep looking at them twice a week. Just go out to look at your arborvitaes or any plants that you have that are susceptible, just to ensure that if the bagworms are present, you're going to be ready to hit them with an insecticide. Or actually pull them off if they're small and just squish them.
Also, boxwood leaf miner is something that we might be on the lookout for?
Yeah, it's been an issue in April, Jeff, but the larvae are inside the leaf tissue. That's really harder to control. You can use maybe a systemic insecticide, prune out the heavily damaged areas and dispose of it. You might be able to use a material with a translaminar activity. What that means is that the material penetrates through the leaf tissue and gets in where the leaf miner larvae reside, and that might provide some mortality of the larva inside the leaf tissue. But if you see the blistering on mostly the upper side, it might be just easy to prune it out and dispose of it.
Some other things to keep an eye out for. Aphids are a possibility as well?
Yes, this is the time of year, especially vegetable gardens and fruit trees. We see aphids very gregarious, feed in large groups, basically the terminal growths. So with the new spring flush of succulent growth coming on, that's the tissue that's going to be very susceptible to aphid feeding.
And they can do quite a bit of damage.
They can cause direct feeding damage, and they also can vector viruses. Aphids are probably they are the leading insect vector viruses that are out there. They're really easy to take care of. You just take a high-pressure water spray and just lodge them off of plants, and they will not come back in most cases because the physical damage in their mouth parts are broken. But they have high reproductive capacity, so that's why you have to be out there on top of it before they just explode, and then you'll see honeydew and black sooty mold on the plants, and that's not a really good situation.
Really no chemical treatment needed then?
Well, there are contact and systemics, but really the easiest thing at this point would be just a high-pressure water spray to dislodge them. Yeah, they're insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils are good contacts as long as you get thorough coverage of all plant parts and make frequent applications. There are systemic insecticides that we use for non-food crop plants like roses and those that'll protect your plants when, for example, the rose aphid starts feeding, it'll ingest a lethal concentration and subsequently be killed. But remember, systemics are applied before the aphids are present. So if you know you're going to get aphids on roses or another one of your plants, this is when you want to make your applications.
Another you mentioned to me was asparagus beetles.
Yeah, asparagus beetles will be out. Of course, the eggs are gray, the larvae emerge, and then you'll see, the adults will have the overwinter, so they'll be out there feeding. Just be out there looking on your asparagus for the beetles. You can hand pick them, small numbers or whatever, or spray some type of contact insecticide. But if the populations are low, I would just recommend hand picking and squishing them or putting into a bucket of soapy water.
A couple of other things, and maybe winged termites and wing ants as well?
Yeah, those are the reproductive swarmers. Got emails about the pictures of winged termites. It's really important to tell the difference. They look the same, but the antenna of the ant is bent. We call it geniculate. And the ant has a narrow area between the thorax and the abdomen, which is the second and third body regions of the insect. They have a very narrow constricted area where termites are pretty much the same from head, thorax, abdomen. They're about the same. Also, the wings of a winged termite are the same size, whereas those for ants, the forewings are larger than the hind wings. So it's important to identify them because the termites would be the most damaging destructors compared to ants. So identification is critical. If you have any questions, just call our business office. They're in Department of Entomology at Kansas State, and they'll find somebody to help you for identification of if it's an ant or if it's a termite.
And there's also some newsletters available?
Yeah, Jeff, we have our Extension Entomology newsletter, which comes out weekly or bi-weekly, depending on what type of activity is out there. So you can just contact the business office and get a link to the website that comes out. We also have Extension publications for just about all of the major insect pests. And, of course, we're developing ones on biological control. We just finished 2 new ones, and we'll be developing one more.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd. For more information, you can also contact your local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.